Good afternoon and welcome to the African American Heritage House and the 2021 CHQ Assembly. My name is Errol Davis and I have the distinct honor and privilege of serving as president of the African American Heritage House here at Chautauqua, or AAHH as we fondly refer to it. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth of 10 lectures that we will sponsor or co-sponsor this season. We are a diverse support organization which is informed by the African American experience. We are committed to strengthening Chautauqua, and we do this in a variety of ways. We do it by encouraging and certainly welcoming diversity. We do it by fostering honest conversations, such as the Mirror Project, and also by adding robust new voices to the programmatic mix, and you will hear one such voice here today. As we are all beginning to understand, it is important that we own both our past as well as our present. We in the AAHH are committed. We are committed to telling the stories that need to be told, primarily from the perspective of historically marginalized people. I encourage all of our viewers to visit our website, aaheritagehouse.org, to learn how you too can support as well as become involved in our work. We are entirely supported by contributions. So I want to thank our many friends and supporters for making both last season as well as this season possible. Without the generosity of our friends and supporters, we would be unable to bring the quality speakers to Chautauqua that we have over the years and are doing so again this season. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for supporting this work. This week's thematic focus at Chautauqua is on many Americas navigating our divides, a subject that's certainly ripe for the AAHH. And our speaker today is DeRay McKesson, a civil rights activist focused primarily on issues of innovation, equity, and justice. DeRay has advocated for issues related to children, youth, and families since he was a teen. As a leading voice in the Black Lives Matter movement, a board member of Rock the Vote, and a co-founder of Campaign Zero, DeRay has worked to connect individuals with knowledge and tools and provide citizens and policymakers with common sense policies that ensure equity for all. He has advised officials at all levels of government, domestically as well as internationally, and he continues to provide capacity to activists, organizers, and influencers to allow them to make an impact as well. Spurred by the death of Mike Brown and the subsequent protest in Ferguson, Missouri, and beyond, DeRay has become a key player in the work to confront the systems and structures that have led to mass incarceration and police killings of Black and other minority populations. He is also the host of the award-winning weekly podcast, Pod Save the People, which creates space for conversation about the most important issues of the week related to justice, equity, and identity. We often hear people use the term walking the walk and talking the talk. Today, we certainly are honored to have someone who is walking the walk. We are honored that he has agreed to share his thoughts with us here today, and I know that you're going to find his remarks both provocative and enlightening. However, before we begin today's lecture, our live audience should know that you may submit questions for our live Q&A with DeRay following the presentation through the submission portal at questions.chq.org, which is on your screen at the moment. It is active at the moment as well. You can do this from any mobile or desktop browser. If you use Twitter, use the hashtag CHQ2021. Today's remarks were pre-recorded. However, they will be followed by a live Q&A with DeRay with questions submitted by you and our live audience tuning in around the world. My fellow Chautauquans, the AAHH is pleased to present to you DeRay McKesson.
DeRay McKesson, civil rights activist, it's an honor to be here today to talk about the things that we've learned in the past 6 years. What does it mean and where do we go from here? Now, when we started, we called it Campaign Zero because we believe that we can live in a world without police violence. We can live in a world where we understand safety beyond policing. So we think about zero both as a goal in terms of those metrics, but also zero as a way to build. That we want people to understand that we actually get to make up community. We get to define what keeps us safe. We actually make all of these things, and all of the bad things are made by man. Man can make them better. and that's sort of the philosophy that grounds us in our work. There's sort of three big ideas that guide everything we do. The first is that we can win in this lifetime. We believe that. This is not a 500, 700-year project. We think we can win in this lifetime. The second thing is that we know that structures and systems will only change if laws, policies, and practice change. That's our goal. The programs are cool, but we are trying to get scaled solutions. And the third thing is that no problem is bigger than community, that you can understand all of these things, which is why we spend a lot of time helping people understand what's true and what's not true, because the status quo exists to make sure that you're too confused, that like you don't understand, you can't understand. Those are all lies by the system. Now, I'll start here because in 2014, when the protests began, people would say to me, you know, and they sort of still say it now, they hint at it. Why are we talking about issues of gender and identity and sexuality in moments where this was about the police? That like the police is what kept people in the street. The police is what was Stonewall. It was what was Ferguson. The police are the only thing that have kept people in the streets over time, especially Black people in this country. Why are we talking about gender and identity and sexuality? And what I remind people is that we are fighting the institution of policing as much as we're fighting the logic of policing. The institution is one way that it shows up, but it's not the only way that it shows up. Then when we think about what is the logic says people with power, people with the most power, make the laws, policies, and practices, and they violently enforce those on other people with less power. That's it. That's what the logic is. The logic is the violent enforcement. What is homophobia if not the heteronormative values and beliefs being violently enforced on other people? What is transphobia if not heteronormative values and beliefs being violently enforced on other people? So we talk about the institution of policing because it's the most visceral form and manifestation of this logic for so many people, but it's not the only manifestation of the logic. That logic shows up in a host of ways across time and space, and we actually want to disrupt all of that. So it is not a surprise that we talk about issues of identity. It's not a surprise that we talk about issues of gender, because the logic of policing shows up in all of those places too. Now, I'll give you a second to look at this. 2020 was a record year in so many ways. People were in the streets, the media covered the protests and the issue in ways that they'd never covered it before, and yet the police killed more people in 2020 than every single year of data we have except for 2018, which is wild. It was not a record year in terms of change. Now remember, we have no data before 2013, so if you got killed by a police officer before 2013 in this country, we don't know. But we thought that 2020 was going to be such an anomaly because the police were going to kill so few people because nobody was outside. And then we look at the data and we're like, the police killed more people. More. That is wild. And it's such a good example of how the media story doesn't always match up with what's true. That we actually have to look at the data ourselves so that we don't get hoodwinked to believe that all this stuff changed and like it actually didn't. Now you look at the data for this year. This year's in red and last year's in pink. We're on track, right? Slightly lower, but the police have killed roughly 1,100 people every year that we have data, and it doesn't look like that's changing. I say this not because it's made me pessimistic. I'm still really hopeful. But I worry that people have declared victory, and I'm like, what was the victory? What was it? I don't know. Because it wasn't the police killing less people. It can't be magazine covers and TV shows. That can't be the way that we think about what it means to win. Now, zoom all the way out and talk about the three big databases of police violence in the country. And knowing the difference is important because you might see numbers reported and think they say one thing when they say something else. So the Washington Post is one of the most popular, and the Washington Post is only on-duty killings that include a gun. So this means that George Floyd's on that database. He was not killed with a gun. It means that Botham Jean, if you remember Botham got killed by Amber Geiger when she walked into his apartment in the middle of the night. She was off-duty when she killed him, which means that Botham's death is not in the database. And the Washington Post code you as armed if you had anything in your hand at the time of death. So this means that Tamir Rice is coded as armed in their database. There's a guy who had a bucket. There's a kid who had a Nintendo controller. Anything in your hand means that you're coded as armed in their database. So we like the Post. We think that methodology is a little troubling. Fatal encounters. Fatal encounters is the biggest of all the databases. Fatal encounters counts two buckets that we don't count, that the other two don't count. That is death by suicide, so suicide by cop, and then medical emergencies. So if you kill yourself in the presence of police, or if you have a heart attack in presence of police, we don't count those. Ours is mapping police violence. It's all on duty, off duty, all weapons, where an officer was actively involved in the death of another person. So we look at this as the most comprehensive database of police violence in the United States. Now, here's something that blew all of our minds. The police actually kill more people in the suburbs than almost all other communities combined. We thought it was cities. Everybody thought it was cities. All of our first projects were about the 100 biggest cities. That was like what we focused on because we thought the problem was most acute in cities. It's not. The suburbs, rural communities, those are the two places where the problem is getting worse over time. Cities is actually one of the only places that it's getting better. Who knew? And I think about this because you can't fix a problem if you don't know where it is, and you certainly can't fix a problem if you're not fighting it where it is. That so much of our work is pointing people in the right direction. Now, we always talk about we never let the system off the hook. We are interested in systemic changes because we know the system is the only thing that scales. Programs are cool. I led an after-school program. I've done a lot of program work. Programs often help people immediately. Programs often exist because the system didn't do something in the first place. All good. But systems are how we get to scaled solutions. And scaled solutions means that as many people as possible are impacted. Now, I'll show you this. There have only been 9 days this year. We do this at the end of every month. There have only been 9 days this year where the police did not kill somebody. That is wild. Look at February. In February, the police killed someone every single day. Look at June. There's only 1 day where the police did not kill anybody. Just because you didn't see it on the news doesn't mean that it didn't happen. That the problem is way more consistent than you ever imagined. And part of our work is to remind people that, it's happening. It's happening near you, it's happening by you, and it's happening every single day. Now, I show you this because this is the rate of police violence when we adjust for population on the left-hand chart. Now, what's important about this is that even in the cities, it's actually not where you think it is. So you look at places like Phoenix. Did you know that 1 in 5 homicides in Phoenix a couple of years ago was committed by a police officer? In Albuquerque, 1 in 3 homicides was committed by a police officer. St. Louis has the highest rate of police violence in the United States. But look at this. It's places like Aurora, Tulsa. You haven't heard those places in the news in terms of police departments. Pretty wild. New York City, for all of its faults, and Lord knows the NYPD has a lot of work to do, it's in the bottom 6 of the top 100 police departments. Now, that doesn't mean that the NYPD is a great place for a community. It does mean that there's so many other places that you haven't even heard of. And it actually has nothing to do with violent crime. A lot of people think that in communities that are more violent, that the police are probably more violent, right? Because to stop violent crime, you might have to use violence. That is just a conjecture. That's just where'd that come from? When we map the rates of police violence and the rates of violent crime across time and place, no relationship. Now, you probably already know this, but I'll give you a second to look at it. Most of the interactions that end up with the police killing people don't start out as violent interactions. So we think about the chunk that's mental health, traffic stops, domestic violence, other nonviolent offenses. For these instances especially, we know that there can be a response to conflict that doesn't result in anyone being killed. And every single dot is a person's life. It's never lost to me that this is about life loss. This isn't, the police threw eggs at people. This isn't like they hurt my feelings. This is a person who will never come back. This is their family. This is their cousins. This is their friends. This is their coworkers. This is a whole community that is encapsulated in one of these dots. Here's the other thing is that officers are rarely charged with a crime. So it's interesting because when we look at it, people think about the criminal route, like we should prosecute the police officer. People think about Derek Chauvin. Interesting. But when we look at the data, it almost never happens. So I never put all of my eggs in the criminal bucket, like the prosecution bucket, not only because I'm not trying to send more people to prison, but also because, and more importantly, because it actually just isn't a route. Police officers are not charged in any substantive way. Now, I'll give you a second to look at this. This is the chart that it blows my mind every time. Every single time I look at it, I'm like, this is wild. Look at this. The highest number of convictions ever for police officers who kill in a given year is 11. 11. The police kill on average 1,100 people a year. The highest number of convictions ever in a given year is 11. That is wild. So I say this because there has to be an alternative. Like, we have to figure out accountability. And if you are putting all your eggs in the prosecution bucket, it's just not it. What is probably more realistic is the administrative bucket, like getting officers fired, making sure they can never work again as officers, making sure there's a civil responsibility. So administrative and civil. Criminal, we have a lot of work to do because prosecutors don't prosecute the police and juries don't convict officers. Now, you definitely know this. There are racial disparities. So Black people are only 13% of the population, but about 27% of all killings by police, and the disparities just increase as we log other things. You know this. The question becomes, what do we do? Now, before I talk about the what do we do, when Adam Toledo got killed by the Chicago PD, he was a teenager, and we were trying to figure out which police departments kill kids under 18. And then we did this and we were shocked. You look at the Chicago PD, by far the outlier. What does it mean that they are killing kids under 18? There has to be a response to conflict that's not murder for kids. And we think about Columbus. Who thought that the Columbus PD and the NYPD would have the same number of kids killed? And you look at Harris County and Houston. Remember, the Harris County Sheriff's Office is actually the Sheriff's Office over at the Houston area. So you look at this and you're like, it actually just isn't what people think, that the data actually helps us see where the problems are most acute. Now, we are always interested in the storytelling because the stories we tell often shape the lessons we learn. What's so beautiful about the protests is that people just came outside their houses and they were like, enough is enough. I didn't call them, a committee didn't call them, an organization didn't call them. People came out because they were like, this is wrong. And one of the things that we always try to remind people is that you have power to start a movement. You can do it. You have the power to change your community, that like your voice is enough. The system is designed to convince you that like you don't matter. That is the way this works. But that's a lie. I think about my grandmother who kept the block safe. She wasn't a part of an organization. She didn't have a card member. She wasn't a card member of anything. But she did it, and her neighbors did it with her because they understood a responsibility to something bigger than themselves. Now, we did something called 8 Can't Wait, which was a campaign about use of force policies. There are 8 policies that we track. Common sense, just not commonplace. You think about things like banning chokeholds and strangleholds, requiring de-escalation, a use of force continuum. Now, some of this is a little nuanced, that a chokehold is a restriction of your airway. A stranglehold is a restriction of the muscles, like when the muscles are constricted. They look similar, but they're not the same. So a lot of places would ban one and not ban the other. We actually led the single biggest reduction of the power of the police in American history, and this was around these 8. Because we were trying to make sure that communities actually did it. So about 19 states have restricted use of force in the past year, over 300 cities. There's never been policy change like this ever before with regard to the police. We're really proud of this. And part of our work, though, is to say that you can do this. And by that, I mean that we actually show each community what they can do. So we take your use of force policy, we rate it across these 8, and we put it on the website. So you can go to the website, you can see with your own eyes exactly what's happening around this. Like you can do it yourself. We believe that's the only way that we'll ever win, is that people know how to do this themselves. Now, I'll show you. All of the things that I talked about are publicly available. So if you go to 8 Can't Wait, you can see for yourself. You can click on a state. You can see what they passed at the state level. You can see what didn't pass at the state level. You can see what was proposed. You can see the actual bills themselves. And these things are important because we'll never win if you got to call me every single time you're trying to understand it. And when you go down here, you can actually see what is happening in a given city. When you click on policy, it'll actually show you the policy, and that's important for us. The other campaign that we have is called Next to 6. And this is a campaign about police union contracts. So there are about 20 states that have state officer bill of rights where there are state level protections that protect the police from accountability. California has a law that says that any investigation of an officer that lasts more than a year can never result in discipline regardless of the outcome. That's wild. There are a host of cities and states. We have all of the 20 states, and then there are over 600 cities, 700 contracts on the site. We have another 3,000 contracts that we're working on coding so that you can go in and you can actually see whatever is wrong with your police union contract that's stopping accountability across the country. Now, one of the other campaigns that we have is about no knock. So you know that Breonna Taylor was killed in Louisville, Kentucky, that the police broke in our house and killed her. Now, we have the only campaign to ban these practices across the country. And what we've done here is that on this map, we actually show you at least one raid that's happened in every single state across the country. Because what happened when Breonna got killed is that a lot of people were like, didn't happen here, wasn't me, not my town. And we remind people that just because you didn't see it on the news doesn't mean that it's not a big deal where you are. But importantly, we actually go and we show you every single piece of legislation that's been introduced across the state, across the country. And there's a rubric so that you can see like what passed, what didn't pass. I'm proud that we actually got no-knock raids restricted in Maine, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, a host of places, and that's just since last year. So our bread and butter is trying to figure out structural change. Like, how do we actually change things at the root? Not cosmetic things. There's some cities that are more progressive. There's some states that are really willing to do it. But the thing that I'll leave you with is that most of the things that we care about, some of the fundamental research hasn't been done. So you've heard of 3 strikes laws. You probably heard of mandatory minimums. If you ask me, DeRay, how many states have 3 strikes laws and what are they for? I don't know. Nobody's done that research. If you ask me which states have mandatory minimums, great question. I don't know. Nobody's done that research. Then we're actually spending the summer putting together teams of people across about 30 areas doing the research so that it can get done. Because we can always tell a good story. I can roll a campaign up. And, there's some states like New York, Illinois, there are places where like the activism is so intense that they will normally lead on issues. But if we're ever going to change this, we got to change it across the country. That this cannot just be one state. We actually have to do this everywhere. And you'd be shocked at how little data exists for that to happen everywhere. The last thing I'll show you is one of our last projects, and it is called the Police Scorecard. So if you go to policescorecard.org, there are about 18,000 police departments in the country, and we have data on 16,000 of them. So 13,000 police departments, and then the rest are sheriff's departments. So you can see data on them. But what's interesting is like when you go, you can actually see data that's never been publicly compiled before. So you can see funding data, you can see officers per population, you can see arrest data, you can see all the data that we have that's available. And that's actually really important because so much of what we spend a lot of time on is helping people realize what's happening in their community, what they can do about it, and structurally what's the fix. It's an honor to be here. I want to be in community with you. If you are focused on solutions, there's a lot more research to be done that'll actually just set up to get rid of all the bad things. We know more than we've ever known. We are in community with each other in ways that we've never been in community. I think if we don't win, it won't be because we couldn't. It'll be because we couldn't organize. That will be the only thing that stops us. I believe in our ability to organize. I think that our understanding of how to do it has never been greater. We just need to make sure that we have all the facts and data on our side. So then when we build a campaign, we don't inadvertently create unintended consequences. And what's really wild is that most of the things that are harming people were just made up. So every single state charges people room and board to be incarcerated in some way. That came from a Reader's Digest article. A lawmaker read the article. He introduced a law, spread across the country. That is wild. A lot of our work is rooted in undoing those things and doing it now. It's good to be here. Excited to be in conversation. I think we'll win.
DeRay, thank you for that stunningly informative presentation. If anything ever showed the power of data, I think that presentation did, and the power to use data to force change. So welcome to Chautauqua. Welcome to the African American Heritage House. I know the last time that you were supposed to appear here in Chautauqua, you had to cancel because you had just been released from jail. And so let me start there. What are your reflections on the issues that you have most focused on, policing and police violence, since that time? What has changed? Has anything changed from your perspective over the last 4 years?
Yeah, so it's so good to be here. And I do remember I was like, you know what? I'm in jail. It looks like I will not be at Chautauqua. But it's good to be here now. In some ways, the biggest change is that we are not fighting people to believe that this is a problem anymore. In 2014, we were trying to convince people. They were like, yep, it's bad in Ferguson. It might be something in Baltimore, but they're like, it's not my town. It's not my city. By 2020, especially with the death of George Floyd, people were like, okay, I get it. Problems everywhere. You don't have to convince me. And that's probably the biggest change. The hard part is that the numbers have remained pretty consistent. The police have killed the same number of people roughly every single year. In 2020, the police killed more people than every year of data we have, except for 2018. That was not a win. So the numbers have not moved as much as we've hoped, but people's focus on solutions has moved. So we think about use of force policies, we think about no-knock raids, we think about a host of other focuses on police union contracts, things that just like weren't happening before.
If I don't want to make broad general assumptions, that's always dangerous, but if you talk about city politics versus suburban politics, one of the takeaways I had from the talk was that deaths going up in the suburbs, police killing in the suburbs, are rising much faster than in the cities. And, are you focused on getting that word out to the suburban crowd as opposed to the traditional inner city crowd where, as you said, in New York City, it's just crawling with activists who are all ready to go? What are you doing to get that message out to the suburbs? Because I think that's just a powerful piece of data that you put on the table.
Yeah, I think the good news is that people want to organize everywhere, and especially because of a Zoom world. We're able to talk to people in communities all over the country in ways that were actually a little hard when everything had to be in person. So we find people in the suburbs of Boston, we find people in the suburbs of New York, in the suburbs of Chicago, like all these places where people are like, yes, I'm ready. I want to do something. I want to figure out like what's going on. I want to like, that's actually really important. And we have the data. We know that these problems are in communities all across the country, and we want people to really understand it because they can change it.
Yeah, I was stunned near the end when you talked about the inadequacy of research on a lot in this area. I mean, it's clearly an important area. You've pointed out some significant data lapses. Are you working with any number of foundations to get studies in these areas financed? Are you bringing this to the attentions of academicians who might be willing to get some graduate students working in these areas?
Yeah, so we have a lot of fellows helping us this summer. We work with researchers because, the good news is that some people have researched parts of it, right? So we had a call today with Dr. Brittany Friedman, who is a scholar on pay to stay. Every single state charges people room and board for being incarcerated. She is one of the leading scholars. And we, her research covers a key part of what we want. It doesn't cover all, like we want a lot more than that. But hers is it's an important place to start. So we always reach out to researchers in the space. We always want to know who's thought about this. We're organizers, right? So we take the information, we help package it, we help tell a good story about it, and we help get it changed. But in a lot of this stuff, people have done some research. Most of the things we're organizing on, there's not a ton of research. So we are having teams of people help us find it. Over the summer, it is a lot of fellows and volunteers. During the school year, there's a hodgepodge of people. But yes, absolutely, there's so much work to do. And this summer is when we have like teams of people trying to get this data.
Yeah, I really continue to be stunned by your presentation, by the data in there, because as you listen to politicians, on one side we want to be hard on crime, that if people are getting killed, well, it's the criminals. But your data suggests that deaths are not a function of violent crime. I think that's something that's truly important that has to be gotten out. Again, talk a little bit more about that point, because I don't want it to get lost at all. I know it was in your presentation, but it's not violent crime. It's what? Where?
Yeah, so, it's interesting. People sort of believe that in communities that have more violent crime, that the police are more likely to be violent, right? Because you need violence to stop violence. That's sort of the way the thought goes. And when you map out the data, you just don't see that. When you map rates of violent crime relative to rates of police violence, like there is no relationship between the two. And we also know, you look at it and you're like, well, what precipitated the police killing people? It's actually not. It's not even suspected violent crime for the majority of things. It's things like mental health. It's things like domestic abuse. It's things like or some sort of domestic violence. It's things like traffic stops. You're like, how are people dying because of traffic stops? Like, really, there's not, traffic stops are remarkably safe for the police. The police fearmonger about it. But when you look at the data, I'm reminded that the single biggest cause of death amongst the police until 2020 was suicide. 2020 made it COVID. People aren't killing the police, right? But that is not what they want you to believe.
Unbelievable. What do you think people misunderstand the most about policing and police violence? What is the biggest surprise for people when you talk to them? What is the single thing?
I think that people don't realize just how pervasive it is. I think that people really do. The police kill about 1,100 people a year. You probably hear about five, maybe six a year. So it's just such a small group that you hear about. And I think that people don't realize that the police have, I think as of the end of June, there are only 9 days where the police didn't kill somebody, right? Like, it's just way more constant than people believe. A lot of people really do think that it's like sporadic, and it's not.
What has been your position on these movements that say defund the police without great specificity, just defund the police?
Yeah, so in general, I'm never sort of attached to a phrase, right? I'm always interested in the idea. And the idea says that we spend too much on this one thing and that we should spend more money somewhere else, right? The idea is also that experts should do what experts do. So who should respond to a mental health crisis? Probably a mental health expert. That doesn't seem dramatic. That seems pretty reasonable to me, right? Who should respond to homelessness? Probably an expert on homelessness, like a social worker. Why do we send a person with a gun to respond to a host of things? That doesn't make sense to me, and that's what the police is. So I think that phrase the attempt is to communicate a host of ideas. I think for people for whom the phrase is hard, I just play with the idea with them. Like, I'm interested at the end of the day about the idea that even in the cities with the highest clearance rates, the police are maybe solving 50% of the murders, maybe 40%. And remember that by the time the police get called in most situations, the vast majority of them, the bad things already occurred, right? So there are a lot of ways to prevent bad things. It's like living wages, food, housing. But by the time you call the police, a conflict has already occurred. So the police are rarely stopping conflict. They are normally intervening in conflict. And part of our belief about society is that we should actually just work to stop the bad things. We shouldn't build this wild apparatus to just intervene.
Fantastic. Have you worked with any police departments on training programs?
No, because the data is not really clear that training changes police officers' behavior. So no.
Interesting. So what is your vision for where we should go with policing in this country? What's the ideal state from your perspective?
Yeah, so we remind people, if you had to think about, I'll ask you, if you just take a minute and think about the place where you feel the most safe, it's probably not a room full of police. So where is it? It's probably a room where you have people you love, where you're sheltered, there are resources. And we believe that everybody should have those things. So safety has never been a function of whether the police are there or not. That when we ask you to think of a place where you feel safe, it's never a room full of the police. It's never a room with the police outside. It's always somewhere else. And we want that somewhere else to be something that everybody has access to. Now, structurally, I think that when we get rid of all the isms, right? Sexism, poverty, racism, I think that will free up a lot of this, right? A lot of the resources. But there will always be conflict, and we'll need a response to conflict. We'll need a response to harm. But let me tell you, we don't need to send people with guns to everything. I mean, that is, even when you look at the police's own data, only 5% of 911 calls are for violent crime. Why are we even sending people with guns for the 95% of other things? It doesn't make sense. So that's how I think about this. I think that structurally it'll be tearing down systems one at a time. It'll be no more no-knock raids. We shouldn't be breaking into people's houses. We shouldn't be giving local police departments tanks, AK-47. Like, you actually just don't need any of that stuff, right? We should be having alternatives to incarceration, especially for young people, for older, we should be thinking about we shouldn't lock people in cages, right? We should be mapping out all of these things.
I continue to be so impressed with the work that you've done in such a short period of time, and I say that relative to my age, of course. So let me talk a little bit about you, about who were your influencers, what experiences propelled you to do this work?
excuse me, we're working on this case in Baltimore. I've been up all night. Um, the biggest influence I probably had was my students. I used to teach sixth grade math in East New York, Brooklyn. Best thing I've ever done. And they gave me so much hope, so much belief. They are the reason why I wanted to fight to build a better world because I knew they deserved it. And like, they were my biggest influence. I've had some teachers, like there were some teachers when I was younger who believed in me and treated my mind as like a mature mind, and that paid off dividends. Like, I remember as a teenager when I was on the yearbooks crew, or when I helped lead a youth grant making organization. Like, I just got lucky to work around incredible adults who poured into me, who were not my family, but who really, really nurtured my mind.
What can we do? What can the average person do to make a difference? I mean, the data you put forward to me are just so powerful. They're so logical. When you say that 95% of the incidents have nothing to do with violence, and why are we sending people out with guns? How can we get the information you have and give it to local authorities? I mean, I found this data just overpowering. What can the average person do to have an impact?
Yeah, so it is. So you can go to campaign0.org. There are a lot of ways that you can get involved. If you just go to the site, all the data that I presented in the PowerPoint is public. So you can see it on the site. Like we as a matter of organizing, we make everything public because we believe that's the only way we'll win. That if you have to call me every single time something happens, like that's just not a way to win. So those are easy steps. But you can also get involved in your community, asking questions. One of the ways that the status quo works really hard is that the status quo makes you think that you're not smart enough to ask questions. The status quo works to make you think that like you don't have a voice, that nobody will respond, and like you'd be shocked that like there are a lot of things that like you could just ask questions. How do we spend the money? Why did the police come to this? What should like you can ask those questions. You're smart enough, you have enough ability, and you have the power.
Mm-hmm. Give me that site again. You went through it rather quickly, and the website.
It's just campaign0.org.
Campaign0.org. If I were to ask you, I'm willing to make 2 policy changes, either locally or nationally. You take the pick. Which 2 would you pick? Which policy changes would you like to see?
In all the states, I think something that would be helpful would be changing the way we deal with low-level arrests, just not arresting people for low-level offenses and putting them in jail, maybe misdemeanors, crime, like citations. So that'd be one. And then the second would be to get rid of every single state officer bill of rights. There are 20 states that have police officer bill of rights, which are state-level protections for the police. And I would just get rid of them in one fell swoop, just like get rid of every single state-level protection for the police from accountability.
Is there, and I have a question that has just come through in our dashboard here. And the question is there a particular community or a model that you see is doing it mostly right? Or who is the closest, from your perspective, to getting it right?
The Maryland police reform bill is probably one of the best reform bills that passed, which is really helpful. So did a lot of good things. It's the best no-knock bill in the country. The way that they empowered citizens to make civilian review, to make citizen decisions around police accountability, best in the country. But frankly, nobody's really doing it well. Like the Maryland bill is probably the best bill that passed last year, for sure. But nobody's really doing it that well.
Do you have another question that just came in? Do you have any insights or thoughts on Mayor Savante Myrick's plans in Ithaca, or if you're aware of them or not?
Yeah, we love Mayor Myrick, and I'm interested to see how it plays out. It's bold, it's imaginative. I have a lot of hope that it will play out, but I'm interested to see. So the data will be the best story about it. It is a good, bold plan. We talked about it before he released it. I was not a part of the planning, but I trust him, and I know his mind's in the right place on this.
Yeah, for some of our listeners who have absolutely zero insights into his plan, what are some of the aspects of the plan that you, and again, I appreciate it's not your plan, you haven't proposed it, but what are some of the aspects that you think should be adopted by others and that you, again, are hopeful that they're going to be successful?
Yeah, I don't know if they should be adopted yet because we haven't seen if they're successful there. But one of the things that he's proposing is to reimagine public safety that doesn't center the police. So, like, whole new division, whole new roles and responsibilities, not people with guns responding to everything. So we'll see. We'll see if this model gets us closer to that as a reality. There were a lot of good people involved in the planning of it, but we will see.
Okay. You have advice for us?
My advice is, the only thing that will change outcomes is structural change. So programs are cool. I believe in programs, but we have to figure out how to change the structure. And most of the things that are about criminal justice, about policing, they are all local. It's your mayor, it's your governor, it's your city council, it's your legislature. The federal government has like a small role, but when local teams are deflecting, it really is deflection. Like it is. This is your locally elected people are the people with the most juice, and that's just the most real about it. Like we have to be focused on them, and that's my advice: is like press those people, ask them your questions. Every time they tell you something is impossible, you should push harder.
Yeah, let me commend you once again because we had an earlier discussion in passing, and I sort of posited from a conservative perspective that people don't do anything that's not in their enlightened self-interest. And when we get to issues of social justice, people often believe it's a zero-sum game. If I'm giving, if they get something, that means I have to give up something. But your data about cities getting better, deaths going up in the suburbs and not in the cities, clearly says to me that as a suburbanite, it is in my enlightened self-interest to take a better look at this, to go to your website, to study the data. My only concern is, again, I assume there's a way on the website for people to say, let me help you publicize these data, because, again, as persuasive as they are, I think many people are going to find them not only new, but shocking. And so, again, I think one of the keys here is getting the word out. How can we do that better? We can have more programs like this. We can listen to your podcast. But again, I do have this concern that this extremely powerful data is not getting out the way it should get out. And do you believe that there are some structural barriers to that happening?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that the data is getting out for people who want to see it. I think that this is only a fraction of the data. That this is only the people that the police kill. The police harm far more people that survive. There's not great data about that. So I think the data is slowly getting out. I think that people see it. I think that people are more interested though in like how do I fix it? What can I do to change the behaviors? And I'm interested in what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. Tell us what you're going to be up to for the rest of the year. Where are you going to be? What are you going to be doing? What can we look for out of you?
Yes. So we're doing a lot of research this summer so that we can launch a whole new set of campaigns in the late fall, winter. So just stay on the lookout. There's, most of the things, like I said in the thing, most of the things that people think there's a lot of research on, there isn't. So if you ask me how many states have mandatory minimums, nobody knows. So we're doing a lot of that foundational research now. So when the fall winter comes, we're ready to go. So that is like our whole summer. That is where I'm head down, 10 toes down, trying to figure it out. Yeah, I think we should be piloting a ton of alternatives to the police. So that is one model of it. What I know to be true is that like sending people with guns to things doesn't make sense. Locking people in cages doesn't make sense. So I'm open to a whole lot of alternatives to those two things. Transformative justice is one way of doing it, like the community remediation or accountability process is one way. We should figure out like what are things that work and then what are things that we can scale. I'm open to all that. One of the best ways to get in front of all of the crimes, though, is actually just to give people resources, to give people access to food and shelter, right? Like those sort of things actually stop a whole lot of things on the front end.
We'll be back once again next week. Next week is certainly a little lighter. It'll be comedy week, but nonetheless, we'll try and look at comedy from an African-American perspective. So again, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.